tour. Always love touring our campuses and refamiliarizing myself with who is where. So now we're going to turn it over to budget and finances. So as Dr. Morris-Kuntz mentioned, this is the culmination of our budget season. And so we're going to walk through what it takes to put a budget together, and then Gina will update you on what we're looking at for 24-25. So our objectives for today, again, provide some insight into the cycle of financial management. I think we're always budgeting in some realm at some point in the year. It's not just a one-time thing, it's an ongoing process. We'll look at how we actually develop the annual budget, look at some of our financial compliance requirements. So we don't just get to budget money wherever we want to. The state has a say in where we spend some of our dollars. And then, as I said, look at 24-25. So I am the Deputy Superintendent over Finance and Operations. And when we do this meeting for a larger group, I always like to say I love answering the question, what do I do? All of these are areas in the school district that are under my realm. So the gold or the yellow ones are the ones I'm specifically involved in, and then in the white is everything under finance. Gina is our CFO, so these are all under her, but I'm assisting with that as needed, but really assisting more these days on facilities and construction. I know someone was in here was on the transportation committee last year when we were looking at how we solve the transportation dilemma. So it'll also support child nutrition, our debt management, and risk management. So looking at the finance cycle. So our fiscal year starts July 1. In Texas, school districts can have a September 1 fiscal year or a July 1 fiscal year. The decision to go to July 1 happened a long, long time ago for Dripping Springs ISD, and when TEA first allowed districts to do that, it better aligned with our federal grants. So our federal grants would start July 1, and so aligning that with our fiscal year made sense. After that, the feds changed it, and now the fiscal year for grants is all over the place, and so that alignment no longer happens. But as a July 1 fiscal year entity, we have to have our budget adopted by June 30, so that is fast approaching. It has to be prepared basically by June 19 because we have to post notices in the paper with a certain time frame, and so in order to meet those time frames, you have to have your budget prepared no later than June 19th. As part of the whole finance cycle, then we undergo an annual audit, and that audit is due to TEA 150 days after your fiscal year. So we're a fiscal year end of June 30, the 150 days takes us to November 27. If you're a September 1 fiscal year, your year ends in August, and you have until January to submit your audit. So it's just some timing differences. And then throughout the year, we have multiple federal and state reporting requirements outside of the budget, and we'll look at some of those. So hopefully you can somewhat see what's going on here. So as I said, July is the beginning month of our fiscal year. So my grandmother was a school cook in a little bitty school in New Mexico, and she was off on summers. So she always thought I would be off on summers since I worked for a school district. And I could never quite get her to understand that summer is my busiest time because we've closed our fiscal year. So our first month, we are really working on closing out the prior year and getting everything ready for the new school year that's coming up. So one of the big rocks that happens in July is at the end of July, we receive our certified values. Certified property values are a huge thing for school districts, and if you've been through any of our other Taxpayer Tuesday events, we've talked about how the funding works. And so we receive those values in July. Now keep that in mind because as we go through the months, you're going to see we're estimating those values months and months in advance. So in August, what happens is our recapture payment is due. So if we haven't been making recapture payments monthly, that is due to the state in August. Our debt payments are due. So our bonded debt, we have two payments, one in August, one in February. So that's not a monthly thing. That's something you have to think about every 6 months. And then TEA issues our first rating. Our first rating is a financial accountability rating. And so those come out in August. TEA gives you the ability to protest that if you think something is wrong. And then the other big thing that happens in the August-September timeframe is adopting our tax rate. With the changes in House Bill 3, our tax rate isn't that flexible for us. The state tells us what our MCR is, our maximum compressed rate. If you've already got golden and copper pennies, then those are set. So really the only flexibility in the tax rate is the debt service side. In September, our auditors come back for the final time and we're finalizing our records. So in October, we're going to take the audit for the prior fiscal year to the board for approval. So from July to September, the finance team is really busy getting the audit finalized. Another big thing that happens in October is what we call the PEEM snapshot. So the last Friday in October is when all school districts take a snapshot of their enrollment. That becomes your enrollment, your official enrollment number for the entire year. So think about it, on a day-to-day basis, your enrollment is changing, people moving in, moving out. So this one point in time is when the state says this is your official enrollment number. The tax levy usually gets sent out or established. We know this past year that didn't really happen until December. And then part of PEEMS is we're also submitting to the state all kinds of data. Data on our staff, data on our students, and this is our opportunity to tell TEA what our official budget is for the year. So even though the board adopts the budget in June, if we've made changes to that after July 1, that amended budget is what goes to the state as our official budget. Then we move into November. So this time frame between October and November is where budget really starts ramping up. So starting in November, as I said earlier, the audit report is due to TEA, but one of the big things we're doing internally is projecting student enrollment for the next year. So this November will be in the 24-25 school year. We'll start working on what do our numbers look like for 25-26. Student enrollment is a very important number when it comes to budgeting because that's what drives your budget. We also are projecting what our local property values are going to do. Who's going to pay their taxes on time? So what is our collection rate going to be? What are our values doing? But I've got this starred. We're also projecting our state values. So another big change in House Bill 3 in 2019 was the state moving us to current values. That means absolutely nothing to you. It makes Gina and I shiver because the state tells us in January of each year what the values for our prior tax year should have been. So this past January, we got our 2023 state values. And all state funding formulas are driven by the state values, not the local values that we collect taxes on. So in October, November, December, we're projecting numbers for students, property values, and state values that we're not going to see at least a year out. So as part of the budget, we're also projecting other revenues. We're projecting, will we need additional teaching staff? Will we need additional instructional aides, custodians, all of the staffing? So we're looking at those FTEs, projecting other costs, and developing our campus allocations. So you can see late October, early November, we really get into budget season and start working on these projections. In the next 6 months of the year, so in December, we take to the board what we think we're going to use for student enrollment, property value growth, new FTEs, and pay raises. And so we typically have the board approve that in January. And we want the board to approve that because we don't want to get to April or May and we've built in a 2% raise and the board says, oh, well, we want a 4% because by May, we are so far down in the budget process that increasing that late in the game really throws a kink in the plan. So we get everybody on the same page in January. That's when we get those state values. That's for the prior year. So those can really mess up our current year numbers as far as revenues and can also impact our projections for the budget that we're working on. There's another PEEM submission in January. That's when we submit our audited financials to the state. So the state gets our official budget as it stands in October, and then they get our final audit. And then that's when we issue budget worksheets to all the campuses and departments. So we've looked at campus allocations, and we've modified them or left them the same, and then we give those numbers out to every campus so they can tell us where to put their money. Remember I told you we pay debt payments twice, so in February, that's the big one there. And in March, right before spring break, we ask all campuses and departments to submit us their budget request. And I don't do that because we're going to work all spring break, although this year Gina did, but I do that because I don't want my principals working on spring break to get their budget. Inevitably, there's one or two departments or campuses that say, hey, I really need the extra time. And so we give them that leeway, but typically all budget requests are due right before spring break so that we can start compiling all of those and see where we really stand. In April, by April 30th, all local appraisal districts are to give a certified estimate of what property values are. And so from April to getting that July number, the numbers can change. We work closely with our appraisal districts to say, okay, you're giving me a number in April, how close is that going to be to the July number? And I will tell you, in my prior history with the district, the difference between April and July was quite drastic, and so that throws another kink in your budgeting. In May, the board approves the compensation plan, so that lays out how much we're going to pay all staff for the upcoming fiscal year. And we're finalizing the budget. So typically in April, May, we have a workshop with the board to say we showed you numbers in December and January and February, now it's May, and this is going to look very close to what you adopt in June. Typically in May, it's the end of the legislative session in odd years. That didn't happen this past session. We had 4 special sessions that ran through the fall. Nothing really came out of those. So in May, we're finalizing the budget. We're seeing what is happening legislatively in an odd number year. We're updating our procedure manuals, and the auditors come on site the first time in the May timeframe. So typically in May, they come, do interim work, and then they finalize that in September. And so that takes us to June. It's the end of our fiscal year. We finally adopt the budget. We amend the current year budget for the last time. And we submit our final student numbers to TEA. So we submitted a snapshot in October of who was here, and then all of the attendance for every 6 weeks is averaged, and we submit our final student numbers, attendance, everything to TEA in June. So that takes you through the full 12-month planning cycle, and then we hit July and we start all over again. So looking more at the budget process. So many years ago, I worked with the board at the time to develop some guidelines, some guardrails for adopting budget and keeping our fund balance at an adequate level. And so I think it was maybe 2014, the board agreed. We were always adopting a deficit budget, but at the end of the year, it turned into a surplus. And so in a previous district, I had done this analysis and said, okay, everyone wants a balanced budget, but to get there, we would have to cut programs. And if at the end of the day, we're going to add to fund balance, what did we accomplish other than cutting programs? So we put these guidelines in place to say we can adopt a deficit budget, but it can't be more than 2% of what our estimated revenues are. And that way, we have some guidelines. So we can't adopt a huge deficit, but this 2% usually turns into a surplus at the end, and we kept our programs intact. And when I turn it over to Gina, she's going to show you how this 2% played into this year's budget preparation. Also, in CE local board policy, the board wanted to make sure that we had an adequate fund balance. And so after lots of discussion, the board agreed to make that 4 months of operating expenditures. So as our operating expenditures grow each year, the required fund balance level grows each year. And this was an interesting year this past year. As I mentioned, tax bills didn't go out till the end of December. We live on tax collections. So typically in December, we would see somewhere between 50 and 60 million in revenue coming in. I don't think we had $1 million this December. So it was this fund balance that was allowing us to cash flow all of our bills without having to borrow money. And so this past year was a great example of why you have fund balance, why you need fund balance, and why 4 months is a good level, because we were able to do payroll, we were able to pay our bills until those tax collections came in, but it was pretty scary. Never in my 30 years have I seen this happen. So everything finance, like I said, starts with the budget. So as I mentioned, we start estimating numbers very early in the year. The first one is the student enrollment. So the other thing the district does is we use a professional demographer that specializes in schools in Texas. And when they do their report, they come in and they talk to landowners, developers, everybody in the district that could impact future growth. They look at census data on birth rates. They look at what our survival rate has been, meaning how many kids in 3rd grade typically move on to 4th grade, so you might have some migration there. And so we take their numbers, because they're the professionals, right? And then we have another tool that we use internally, and we compare. So this past year, our enrollment was less than what the demographer projected 2 years previously. And that's because inflation got crazy and interest rates went crazy, and so people weren't moving as quickly as they were in the past. And so that's why it's good that we do our own internal, because now we're basing future growth on reality, not inflated numbers from the demographer. And so we did receive a new demographic study this past January, and so we'll compare when we get into next fall. We'll start comparing what did our fall enrollment look like compared to what they were projecting for this upcoming school year. This is also when we're estimating all of our other revenues. Like I said, our campus allocation amounts, the board approves the assumptions, and then this seems to be a hot topic. So campuses all get the same dollar amount per student per grade level. So every elementary campus gets the same dollar amount per student. The 2 middle schools get the same dollar amount. So that provides equity across the system. Departments are a little different. So just because technology had $3 million last year doesn't mean they're going to have $3 million this year. So they have a special worksheet, and they pretty much build their budget from the bottom up, but they use prior years as a guide. So we know in transportation they're going to have the same expenses every year. The variable is, are we driving more miles? Have gas prices gone up? Is our fleet aging and we're going to have more maintenance? And so it's a quasi-zero-based budget in that we don't give them an empty paper and say start from zero, but they have to justify anything above what they're asked for from the previous year. And then we take all these expenditure requests and we look at revenues and what kind of position are we in. So estimating revenues, that sounds really simple. Yeah, really simple. Student enrollment is the big one. That's really the only way we increase our revenues. So you can go back to one of the first Taxpayer Tuesdays to understand how schools are funded. So if we have more student enrollment, then we get more revenue. If we have less student enrollment, we get less revenue. But how much we keep or pay and recapture is then tied to our tax collections based on our local property taxes. So again, back in December, we were trying to estimate what are our values going to do locally. And it's been a fun few years because they're doing this, so there's no trend. And then based on those local values, what do we think state values are going to do? And then other revenues. So estimating revenues is quite challenging, especially in a year when you have legislative changes, you have property value fluctuations. So as an example, last year, you looked at the chart, last year our values increased, was it 21%? 21%. This year, 5. So before that it was 30. So values are doing some crazy things. I love the good old days when values were just doing a steady 8%. It was so easy. And those days are gone.
I would vote for you for president.
So I'm going to start at governorship first. So as I said, campuses are given the same amount. So for regular instruction, every elementary gets $115 per student, middle school $126, high school $127. Why does it go up? Because you have more expensive programs the older the students get. But then we have these special program allocations. So remember I said the state tells us we have to spend money in certain areas. So we report to the state, all of our special ed students, our bilingual, GT, comp ed, every program that a student is in gets reported to the state. And then you'll see in a future slide, we earn money on those students in a higher amount than a regular education student, and those funds have to be spent in that area. So even though we're pretty much funding our entire program on local tax dollars, the state tells us how we have to spend those. And then the other thing we do, because there's so many estimates in here, so if we say, Maureen, you're gonna have, what'd you say, 983 students next year is your projection? We're going to give her money based on 95% of that number. So she doesn't get the full amount. And the reason is, when we get to that October snapshot, in this coming October, if she has 990 students, she's going to get more money, the difference between that 95 and the 990. But if she only has 950 students, we're going to take some money away, and that makes the playing field level for everybody. So after snapshot, you get adjusted to what your actual student population is.
Maureen, I'm sorry, the stupid question, but that's for everything outside of payroll.
Yes.
Wow.
So that's for scissors and paper.
Paper, all the operations. We budget payroll at the central level. So not a stupid question.
Books? Or is that separate?
Most adopted books we provide through the instructional materials allotment. So this is consumables. And what I love is we have a statewide forum where other school districts ask questions, and a district will inevitably in January say, what do you allocate to your campuses? Well, it's not an apples to apples comparison, because in your campus allocation here, that's going to include your copier rental cost, the supplies for the copier, your nurse, your counselor, your assistant principal, your library, PE, all of the things. Another district, for example, a larger district that I worked in, PE, art was budgeted at the central level so that all campuses were uniform. So what's paid out of this campus allocation can differ from district to district. And so when people go out and post, what is your campus allocation? I'm like, whoa, you got to understand what is covered in that. Because if we said, well, we're going to give you another allocation for library that would be above and beyond this regular allocation, and it varies from district to district on how they do that.
And class size in elementary is 28?
22.
22?
22.
So you're talking $2,600?
No, about 50.
Yeah, I was going to say about 50 or so, and then as you move into middle and high school, it's larger. It's much larger than that, 100 and something, 200,000 for a high school, especially when you include fine arts and band and those programs and CTE.
So the other big thing to keep in mind is any cuts are made across the board. So right now, or the last 2 months, we've been working on cuts for next year. I can't just say, Walnut, you've got to cut all your travel, because maybe she only put 1,000 in travel when Dripping Springs Elementary put 5,000. So what we would do is we would come take that 115 and lower it to 113. And typically we just take that out of the supply and then they can amend. So if we make cuts at the campus level, we do that uniformly. We don't just say we're going to cut a certain area because each campus budgets differently. Okay, this required spend. So certain student populations generate additional funding, and then a percentage of that has to be spent in that program. So if we earn $10 million for special ed, we have to spend a portion of that on special ed. We can't just say, oh, well, we got $10 million for special ed, we're only going to spend $1 million there. And then in special ed, you have what is called maintenance of effort. So if you spend 10 million this year on special ed, you have to spend 10 million next year. You can't lower that or you get penalized. And so we're very careful about how we allocate funds and where we spend funds because it resets each year. And if your expenditures are doing this, then you're locked into that unless you can show a decline in students or a high cost student. There's some exceptions, but typically year over year, your special ed expenditures have to remain the same. So this is what that required spend looks like. So our estimated revenue, so of our total revenues of say 89 million, 15 million of it is generated in these special populations. And then you can see in the second column the required spend. So dyslexia, education, early education, gifted and talented, 100% of those dollars have to be spent in those areas. The others are 55%. It used to be 90, 85%, and then one of the stimulus packages years and years and years ago lowered this to 55, and the state's never changed it. So you can see at the revised budget and then our projected activity. So we earned 8 million in special ed, but we're expecting to spend over 13 million. So we typically don't have a problem spending our required. If we do, it's usually in career and technology. And so the 55% is not too difficult to meet, but the point of this is our budget isn't necessarily flexible. The state tells us where we have to spend a large portion of that.
Can I ask a quick question on that? The
Yes.
GT number went way up. How come? I'm curious.
Wait, what was your question? I can't
The
hear.
gifted
GT?
talented allotment, it looks like it went from
Well,
245.
GT's capped, so,
But our projected activity is,
we probably had some coding, like teachers weren't coded maybe correctly, and then when we recoded them, we monitor that every year, like in September and October, and we did a lot of that this year, where their coding maybe didn't carry over correctly, and we went back and coded all the teachers to what they were truly doing,
I see.
and that will drive that.
Okay, thanks.
all right, so I'm gonna turn it over to Gina. I think you know all this. And then she's gonna update you on where we are on the 24-25 budget that the board will be asked to adopt in June next month.
Okay, more fun with numbers. So the state law requires us that we adopt by function. So the function tells us where we're spending the money, whether it's on instruction or professional development. So you'll see most of our funds are spent like in instructional services, but TA is tracking that, and it is required that we adopt at that level and we amend at that level. So if we adopt and we need to move funds around in or out of instruction, we take that to the board and they have to approve the movement of those funds. So we can see that we're spending the money where we should be, which is basically instruction. The object code that we have like a 20 segment account code, and all of them mean different things. There's a fund, a function, object, sub-object, there's all these different layers to it so that we can dig into how we've spent the money. But the next segment that is most important is the object, and that tells us whether or not it's personnel or non-personnel, contracted services versus travel, things like that, so we can easily pull that data and analyze it throughout the year. And here's all of the function codes that we have. Again, the classroom is you're going to see most of the funds are budgeted in that area, and then they break it down from there. I mean, you have curriculum and professional development is 13, food service is 35, extracurricular activities is function 36. So these are all, this is again a way that we analyze, and TEA monitors how we're spending the funds and that we're spending it appropriately. So function is really important to school districts and that you're looking at it all year long. Again, the object codes, that's really more about, are you spending it on personnel, are you spending it on contracted services, supplies, travel, debt payments. Again, they kind of monitor that, and we can pull data and look at things like capital outlay. If you're spending a lot of capital outlay out of your general fund, why? A lot of times you'll see that more in your bond funds. But at times like portables and things like that will be coded because they're big ticket items. And so we're monitoring that again throughout the year. Program intent is really important. That's what Elaine was talking about earlier. So like your dyslexia students, your special education students, you're bilingual, they all have a program intent code. So again, we pull that so we can tell that we're spending on those students, and that's how we were monitoring our spend requirement earlier, is we're pulling it by that PIC code and making sure that, one, we're estimating the revenue that we're getting, that we know what we're getting there, and then we're spending it on those students, and we're monitoring that at least 3 or 4 times throughout the year to make sure that we're gonna meet that spend requirement, and if we're not, why not? Are things not coded correctly? Did something, fall out of the budget and we didn't realize it, so that we can see what's going on and go in and dig into that. So we're looking at that throughout the year as well. And then of course you have your organization, which is your campus or department, just so that we can see by campus they can monitor and manage their funds at that level.
So we can pretty much look in an account code. Here's kind of a printout. We can look at the account code, tell you where it's happening, what it is, what student it's targeting,
What fund it's coming out of.
how it's being funded. Like every segment of that 20-digit account code means something.
Correct.
I'm thinking of a day in the life of a teacher,
Oh, yeah.
and I'm wondering, all of this allocation of expenses, does the teacher have to input any of this data, or does this all come from the
No.
expense level that you do when the expense occurs, it gets put in one of these boxes?
Their teachers are letting their admins or their principals know their needs, and then that's going through the admin assistant, and they're coding stuff in the system and making sure that it's coded correctly. Teachers typically don't have a lot of knowledge about the account codes because they're very complicated. I mean, I have to go research the account codes all the time myself, and I've been doing budget for like 15, 16 years. And it changes. Things change every year too. So they'll start identifying a student, like dyslexia students now are identified. 2 years ago they weren't. And so all of these things consistently or constantly change. And there's no way a teacher really should be, this is kind of in the weeds for them, and we wouldn't have that expectation. We really want the front office and the principal kind of managing those funds and then asking the teachers to feed in and let me know what you need. And then that's how they're building their budgets too, is they're talking to their teams and what are the needs. And they get additional funds for these specific programs like dyslexia or SPED. They're also talking to those teachers and saying, what is it that you need? So we put money in the right place. So throughout the year, and we can always move it. We can move funds around as they need it. But they're trying to develop those budgets early so that they don't have to move funds around. So they should be collaborating with their teachers and kind of giving an idea of the needs that they're going to have throughout the year. Supplies, professional development. It's really more those things. Those are the biggest things that teachers are looking for, supplies for the classroom. Again, travel, professional development that they might think that they need or their staff needs. Those are probably the biggest things that they're looking at whenever they're talking to their teachers, I suspect. Right?
But it's very important that the
Yeah.
principal and the
It
campus
is.
secretary understand all this, because otherwise they don't put their money in the right spot, and we're amending constantly throughout the year.
And we're providing trainings every year, so our office is also bringing all those staff members in, and we also talk to the principals about coding, that they really need to be working with their admin. We also do sign-up sheets throughout the year of what are you having difficulty with, so we can come out and help you and provide you training. So we're trying to assist the admins as much as possible, because people that are new, this takes a hot minute to
And even
figure
today,
out.
we'll disagree
We
on how
do.
we should
I
code
mean-
something. I was like, well, I think it should be here. She's like, I think it should be here. And then you go look at the guiding documents, and it's great.
It's really great. It doesn't give you, it should be this. It's not finite, and so there's a lot of gray going on. So, and you'll find districts coding things very different depending on the leadership and how they're reviewing or looking at the FASRAG, which is the TEA's accounting guideline. So we're checking that constantly. I have it downloaded on my desktop, and we're looking at it almost, all the
But
time.
this is the same coding structure for every school district in the state. So through those PEEM submissions, the goal is that the legislature can look at reports and say, well, all school districts are spending X amount on supplies. And then they use that to write new laws based on how we're coding this. So the account coding is very important, but you will find from district to district, it's not consistent.
It is not. And you would see, like, Like, for instance, I keep going back to function 11, which is the driving force, right? So you'll see the majority of funds and all districts should be coded there. I can tell you if TEA saw that someone was spending 40%, they would have a huge issue. That there's something going on at that district, either they're not coding correctly or it's very imbalanced, because your focus is typically on instruction costs, and that's where you're going to see most of the funds are in and should be there.
So you could think of this as a matrix with the object codes on one axis and what's the next one called?
And there are some matrices that TEA puts out, so like in function 11, you can't have this object. You
Right.
can't have a debt
Yes.
payment in function
Correct.
11. That will kick you out in PEMS. We know this is a mistake.
Yeah, you coded it wrong. In 700 org, which is your finance department, basically, you can't see a function 11 in there. The PEMS will say that you don't have instruction in finance. So they'll call you out and we go look at it, and usually it's a coding error or we coded something in the department wrong or something else.
How often does the state check in on the codes and how you're operating?
Well, they're monitoring throughout the year, all districts, and so they'll audit certain things, and that's why auditors come in and look at all the stuff and make sure that we're coding things correctly and we're reporting things and purchasing things correctly. And then TEA is looking at it too. I mean, all their staff members are monitoring all of the districts, and sometimes they'll do audits.
But officially, it's in October when we submit that official budget, and it'll go through that checker and make sure there's nothing that conflicts. And then when you submit the final audit, you're sending all this information again.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And so this is the revenue, for us specifically. Like if we were a lower socioeconomic or didn't have high property values, you would see more state aid or state funding coming in. You can see ours is about 85% is local, so we're getting the majority. That's going to change some due to this last legislative session, right? They implemented the 100,000 homestead exemption. Well, that means that state aid will rise some, and then the local property taxes will go down some. So you'll see that fluctuate probably in 24, 25 for sure. And here's the expenditures. Again, we're payroll obviously intensive, we're people intensive, we're providing a service, and they're provided by teachers. And so 83% of our payroll is for people. So trying to reduce budgets or trying to find savings is very difficult outside of the payroll because there's not a lot. And there shouldn't be, but there's usually 13, 15%. That's everything else. That's all your contracted services. That's your utilities. That's your platforms that students are using and teachers are using. That's only 13% or so of the budget, 13, 15% of the budget. The rest of it is people intensive. And so we'll kind of look at some of that here in a minute, focused on 24, 25. And here's the function, like I was talking about. You can see instruction, that's 11, is 60%. And should be. Again, if you saw a district spending 40%, there's something wrong there. There's something, our focus and our service is instruction, so that's where you're going to see the majority of the funds spent. The next largest one is instructional support, so like library, I think is in there, professional development, your instructional coaches, things like that that are supporting the classroom are the next biggest percentage. Okay, so for 24, 25, this was specific. Again, this has been very challenging. I've done budget for a long time. This is a very challenging year due to the legislative changes. It changed a lot of things. It really meant what impacted the most was getting started late because there were, I think, everybody was kind of hoping with the special sessions that we would see some additional funding coming into school districts, but that didn't happen. And they made significant changes to property tax. Right, and that's great for the citizens, and we want to see that. But it was so late in the game and implementing it this year that it caused budget to get really pushed back because we didn't have good data. So the tax office and the CADs were trying to scramble to build in the additional homestead exemption, and it caused us pushing. We're starting in December, and we started in December, but we figured out we had some not great data, it wasn't correct, and so we knew CPTD was wrong, so the comptroller values were wrong, and so we were working through that, and it caused us to kind of push things out and figure out that we were looking at some significant a deficit next year that's over or exceeds the guideline that we have in place here in Dripping Springs. So these are the key drivers that kind of drove that. The enrollment projections slowed down. So we talked about that. Well, we had our demographer come back in this last year, and the projections changed significantly from what we had been using, like since June. And that happened in January. We're talking, and I think some of those numbers are in here in a second, but I'm talking about 300 to 600 students difference, which significantly impacts our revenue estimates. Then the legislature didn't provide additional funding that we were hoping for. They had 4 legislative sessions. They had $18.6 billion that was for education, came back in. None of that went back out to school districts. And in the following year, so this next year, it doesn't have to. Now it goes into the general coffers and they can do what they want to. So it does not mean that that 18 will eventually come back to school districts. Now it goes into the general coffer and they build the budget for whatever their priorities are for future years. So we'll see what happens. The basic allotment is $6,160. So for every student that's in attendance, we're receiving that amount of funds. That was set in 2019. That has not changed since 2019. And that is significant. For Dripping Springs, we've been growing at such a fast rate with students that we're seeing additional funding that was keeping pace, right? The revenues were keeping pace with the needs, with the expenditures, and staying in line. Well, whenever enrollment dropped off, now we're receiving less revenue. We still have needs with inflation and everything else, and then trying to keep up with, pay with surrounding districts and pay your teachers what they deserve. That is impacting all school districts. So it's not just us, this is going across the state. If you're looking at any of the news, you've probably seen it. Yeah. Austin has a huge deficit. They're cutting and doing reductions. Katy is, Fort Worth. I mean, some districts are closing campuses. I mean, there's a lot of things going on. So it's not just here. It's definitely a statewide issue. The other big impact, and again, this is to all school districts as well, we received some emergency relief fund during the COVID years. That funding expires, so it's no longer available. So anything that you added with those funds or that you move from general fund to those funds now has to come back or you get rid of it. And every district is seeing that. I will say Dripping Springs did a really good job. There wasn't a lot of added stuff, but those funds were very restricted. And so finding what you could put or use those funds for, it was very limited. So it was all about like summer school and tutoring, things like that. It was very focused on the gap, and that's understandable, but you either added staff to do that or you moved stuff from general fund. Dripping, we moved our summer school costs from general fund over to ESSER funds. And they also purchased a couple of programs to monitor like the gap and what's going on and how you're getting students caught up from the ESSER stuff. Well, now all of that has to go back into general fund. So a lot of it was a movement from general fund, but obviously we have to have summer school. So some of these costs, so over $700,000 is coming back into general fund. And it is an add to the general fund budget because for the past 3 years or so, we have not been funding it out of general fund. So that's an add to the budget. So all of these things have play an impact on what we were seeing projecting for 24-25 back in January, February.
Sorry for asking too many questions.
No, please.
The 18.6 billion surplus, that is the state surplus. It's not allocated to education though, it's in the general fund. Is that correct?
A lot of this was specific to, because it was from recapture, like all the districts playing the recapture. So basically, and you would think that that would automatically go back into education, but it's not.
It was set aside in the previous session to be given to education. They never got their vouchers passed, so they never distributed the money. So
Right.
going into the next biennium, it'll just go into their revenue.
Right now, it's not allocated to anything.
No, it's not. It's just
in the general fund.
correct.
So the fact they're collecting less, the fact that we're all collecting less means the burden on the state will be more in the next couple years. So they're gonna have to have more revenue to fill the gap, right?
Eventually, yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
So,
yeah.
the tax on us is gonna,
With the homestead exemption, it will cause the state to have to.
right, so it's gonna have to come up with money from someplace.
That's correct.
So
See how
they're
that kind of plays out
basically mortgaging the future.
a little bit. Okay, so this is the student growth. I just kind of wanted to put this, because this is such a key driver, so you can see, if you can see, because I know I can't see, but so this is 22, 23 right here, 21, 22. So there's 8,000, a little over 8,000 students. And you can see we're just kind of ticking up at a very consistent rate. 22, 23 was here. And then here in 23, 24, right, the projection was 8,800. So it was the red line that keeps going up. The actual was 8,538. So it was significantly less than what we were projecting. And I just kind of showed going out what the projections were versus how the projections have changed. So it doesn't mean that you can still, we're still growing. We're just not growing as fast. We were growing in probably about 600 students, so almost an elementary campus in some years. Now we're talking maybe 300 or so instead. They do anticipate, or they being the demographers, do anticipate this coming back, the growth picking back up in the next couple of years. I mean, obviously nobody has the crystal ball, but that is the expectation. It's just for the next couple of years. This year we're trying to kind of get through this 2-year problem and hopefully come out on the other side, and we'll see that growth pick back up, or we'll also hopefully see some additional funding from the legislature in next year. So this is just kind of to really show you the impact that it had. And this is for this year. So we built a budget based off of that top number, that 8,854. But the actual PEAMS enrollment was 8,500, and we're staying about right there. So we haven't grown a lot or lost a lot since then. We're still kind of, we go up and down every day, but it's staying about 8,500. That's a 316 student decrease. But more importantly, because we're funded off of average daily attendance and not the actual enrollment, we have to look at that. Well, really, we're about 457 kids down, because whenever our enrollment, or our ADA, averages about 95%. And we budgeted on that. We didn't budget on the 8,800, we budgeted on the 83, 88, but still, when you look at the difference for ADA, it's 457 students. That equates to about $3.7 million. So that's the decrease that we've seen this year, that we've been trying to make up.
How many million?
3.7 right there. Yeah. So then we started looking at next year. When we got enrollment numbers in January, we started looking at next year. So back in June, when we were projecting, the projection was 9,483 students for June for 24-25, with the average daily attendance being 89-84. When the projections changed in January, it reduced almost 676 students when you look at the ADA. That's about $4.3 million, $4.4 million impact to what we were previously projecting. So we're constantly looking at it, right, and updating the numbers. But again, we kind of got a little bit later start this year than we would like to for several different reasons. And so in January, it was kind of really eye-opening. It's like, oh goodness, this is not, we really have to start paying attention to this. And this is kind of when we started talking to the board and letting them know that we had some concerns about 24-25 and how we were going to move forward and what we were going to do in regard to the budget. We talked.
Question, is there any change in the last few years over the ADA percentage of total?
There is. Prior to COVID, I think the average here was about closer to 96%. Was about the average, and that's pretty normal for this district and the district I came from. Actually, when you went through COVID, you're talking huge dips, like 93, 92. Have we gotten back to 96? No, we have not. We've definitely, and that's a problem across the state as well. Definitely discuss it with other CFOs and other districts. They're having the same issue, if not even worse. There's lots of districts that are even in the 80s. 89, I mean, I'm sitting there, just kids and families are not, this is not a priority anymore. It's definitely a cultural shift since we had COVID. Of course, you've got the online stuff. We have families here that have opportunities to travel and do those experiences, and they do, which it has an impact on our revenue. And that's just the fact of it. We would love to be funded on enrollment, because when the kids aren't here, it doesn't mean the teacher doesn't get paid or they go home. I mean, we're still paying the same staff members and doing the same things. So it definitely has a huge impact on all school districts, but I don't think that will ever change. They can't afford to change that. What we really need to see is an increase in the basic allotment. We need more funding per student. That's what we need and we need it to match inflation. And it hasn't, I mean, everybody knows things have gone up since 2019.
Yes.
And it includes for school districts, so we're no different. So we're living on the same amount of money. So back to the policy. So again, Elaine talked about this earlier. We have a policy in place where we can adopt a deficit budget. And that has happened, we did the history on this, and I think it's happened almost every year for the past 10 years, except for maybe one, where they adopted a deficit budget, but then ended with either a balanced or surplus budget. So this is definitely working, right? But what we found this year was, so the 2% was about $2 million. That's the deficit that we could adopt and be within policy. When we started looking at what we were estimating revenue and the expenditures we need in place, we were looking at $4.8 million. So we have been working, the district as a whole has been working to reduce expenditures and increase revenues where we can. They've done a great job. We have worked on that, and we are very close to doing that, because we certainly don't recommend, we would never recommend adopting a $4.8 million deficit. You couldn't do that on an ongoing basis, because you would bankrupt the district at some point down the road. We have found a lot of things where we can reduce the budget. So this is what we've done this year, just so that you know. We have increased fees, some fees, it's pre-K. Now qualifiers who qualify for pre-K, they don't pay anything, but we allow students, their parents to send their students here, and they do pay a tuition. We increase that tuition. We're increasing facility rental fees, which had not been increased in several years. So we're doing some of that. That resulted in about, $230,000 more in revenue. We're estimating maybe a little more than that, could be less. And we have reduced expenditures. One of the things we did, we talked about the allocations for campuses. We did a 5% cut across the board. That way we're maintaining that equity. We just reduced it out of their supplies. And then again, we will still shore up at Peens and see what they'll just be 5% lower for the year. That got us $50,000. I mean, it was nothing total. Like, that wasn't from one campus. That got us about $50,000. We went back to campuses and said, hey, we really need you to dig in. We need you to cut things. We need you to define stuff. And they did. I've been really impressed with this district and the collaboration. Everybody's come together. We've met with principals. We've gone to every campus and had discussions with staff just to make sure that everybody knows what's going on, and we're being very transparent about what we're doing. But departments came back, and they came back with quite a bit. And so this is helping us with next year's budget. We don't want to impact programs at this point if we do not have to. So we're freezing on-campus positions. We've frozen several. There are 3 central admin. There's some custodial. These are all vacant. So we're not moving, or we're not letting people go. If something becomes vacant, we're going to be evaluating whether that position has to be filled. There were some maintenance positions. We are repurposing some positions. Again, those positions, some of them have people in them. We're trying to give them something else within the district to look at to see if they can move into that. We've done some class size changes for next year. That means it's from 2nd to 4th at elementary. Instead of 22 to 1, we're moving to 23. That was a cost avoidance. We're projecting that we would have to hire less teachers. So again, it's all through vacancy or attrition, but we will see, you may see some class sizes that are bigger. It doesn't mean that every class would have 23 kids in it, because it just doesn't work out that way. It depends on how many students come in at that grade level, but you might have a class or 2 that has 23 in it, and we're looking at doing that at least through this next year so that we can try and get through this. And then we moved some of our costs to other federal funds. So we have some special education federal funds, and we were able to kind of reevaluate those positions and move some contracted services and some other things over out of general fund into a federal fund. So this is kind of all working towards, trying to get to that 2% deficit,
So
and we have gotten it.
sorry, when you're considering class size, that's not taking account of high school, because I said what was high school.
Correct. High school, they looked at efficiencies, and we were able to find some positions there, like not have to hire as many by, they were looking at class schedules and master schedule, and they got with HR and had meetings, and we were able to find some efficiencies there and reduce the number of FTEs that we needed at high school and middle school.
Yes.
So, yeah, we're looking everywhere we can. We had athletics go back and dig in, and they came back with reductions. So we've definitely pulled in every department and every program to say, what can you do, or what can, as a team. And everybody's kind of dug in and done everything they can. And so we have gotten to where we're going to adopt a 2% deficit. We were there. It is concerning for the future. So we have a legislative year. If things don't change, we will be starting budget in September, because if things don't change, we have to be prepared for future years, because it will be an additional reduction if
So
we
our
don't see something.
boosters become even more important for each sports, band, extracurricular activities, PTA. I mean, I'm looking at
Everything
this
becomes important. I still think, if something doesn't change, it's significant enough, we're gonna have to look. I don't know what we have all these ideas, and we're gonna have to come together and come to the community, go to the campuses and start talking about what we can do different if something doesn't change, and we have to be prepared for that. We don't want to end up in March or April and trying to figure this out and just assuming or hoping that something's gonna change, because we don't know. I think vouchers will pass. I mean, that's a personal opinion, but I think vouchers will probably pass this next year. And I don't know if there's any motivation to give public education additional funding. So if they can get it passed, then what's the motivation to do so? So I don't know that, and I'm hoping that we will see something, but there also may be lots of strings attached to that. And sometimes if you don't have the flexibility, we're still going to end up in a situation where we don't have enough funds to cover everything.
So we really need to form, like we did with transportation committee, we need to form some sort of committee to start.
We are talking about that. We are for next year, trying to get through this year to adopt this one right now. It's just been a crazy, but there is discussion about how are we going to approach this next year? How do we get feedback from community, from the schools, make sure that we have buy-in, that we're all on the same page when we decide to move forward and what that looks like. So definitely there will be discussions for sure with community and everybody else.
I'm not asking you to do it right now.
Okay.
But-
Good. Whatever it is, thank you.
But as I listen, I could say, well, you're making all these cuts, why didn't you make them before? Okay? If they're out there, they're efficiencies, why didn't you do it before? And that's an argument you often hear about schools. There are excesses. They could make these changes and it's not having any impact at all. If
I
you
would
were
not
able
agree
to-
with that.
No,
I
no,
can tell you.
no,
Okay, I'm like, I definitely don't agree
I
with
don't want to
that.
precipitate that discussion. What I would like you to do, though, is have a list of those things for us. Because when we talk to friends,
Mm-hmm.
and they say, look, they made all these changes, it sounds fine. They're going on,
Yeah.
in your own words, we found these efficiencies from someone who believes you were probably operating pretty efficiently before. That sounds like, you had slop money. Tell us what we're giving up when, $2 million was found. What are we not getting? What are our kids not getting? Are they in classrooms?
And it's
Portables.
especially like in
So
that
let's-
long term, like it might be okay to pinch to tighten that belt for like a year, but if there's literally no guarantee of increased funding in the future, this isn't sustainable. It means that Dripping Springs can't continue to be the district that we have always been. And I think that is really important messaging to have not today.
Absolutely, no, no, I agree. I understand what you're saying. I agree, yeah.
Being in a district which politically is so balanced, it goes either one way or another. When we talk to our friends, you know, if they hear it's not an issue, then they're not gonna change their votes. They're
Right,
not gonna vote for somebody who's concerned about schools, in regard to somebody who doesn't care about schools.
right.
Well, that's why it's important for us as a community to actually encourage our partners here in the community to go, look at the slides, call, ask questions. We have to be the forefront to be informative in our community.
We need community members to get involved this next
Exactly.
year for sure, to
100%.
get some of the answers that you're talking about, because I think there is rhetoric out there and about schools not being efficient. And I can tell you this was digging deep for this district to do this. We don't have anything else. It's gonna be I mean, it really is, and I don't mean that lightly. I really don't. It's, we have nowhere else to cut. And the stuff we're doing is gonna be impactful to the areas that are, you know, that are taking on those reductions or the additional students. Some people aren't gonna like their kids being in a class with 23 students. It's supposed to be 20 to 1.
Have had impact because we can't give the raises to bring people in.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, and the board really wanted to do that, but then we have to find reductions somewhere else if we do that, because it's about 700,000 for 1%, right? We're giving 1% this year for 24-25. That's what we're proposing. It's not been adopted yet, but another percent is about $700,000, which means then you have to find reductions of 700,000 somewhere else, and
So
we don't
this-
really have it.
This gentleman was asking what we're missing. I can tell you from a high school point of view, my son was told by the counselor, he already had 4 years planned out, and some of the upper, harder classes that he was wanting to take that has very few kids in it, they're gone. They will not be available. So that was a hard thing to tell our kids this year, especially our freshmen that came in and our sophomores who are looking to. I mean, we have kids, we have really excellent kids, guys, that are full scholarship to Harvard. I'm one of the test proctors for our school district, so I know. And we've got to do something. We have to get involved. We've got to get everybody involved as much as possible. And like you said, I was on transportation committee, and that was very effective what we did. And
Well,
how
that's
we
an
came
example of like,
Yeah.
people felt pain because we
We
didn't
did.
have buses.
We have to feel pain in
It's
order.
Terrible
yes.
that we had to go
Yes.
that far, but
Right.
that's
Yeah.
oftentimes the only thing people feel is what's actually affecting their
Exactly.
daily lives.
That's right, Terry.
So we are, as I mentioned this earlier, that we are anticipating the growth to pick up. And so we're hoping this is just a 2 to 3 year problem for dripping, but we want to be prepared. I do not want to be on the back end of that. We need to be on the front end of this in case if things don't change, enrollment doesn't increase, we don't get more funding. We've got to be able to address this in a timely manner and that it's thoughtful and it's intentional. And so you'll see more about that.
I wonder if you could quantify how many hours you're spending on having to find these budget cuts.
Oh my God.
You could be doing something else.
It's been a year for me, but for sure, but I think all districts are going through it, so, and this is my job.
I'm looking at the collective
Yeah,
cost for all the districts scrambling for money in the couch cushions.
right.
Seems like hours y'all could spend doing something else.
We thank y'all for being deep and doing
Yeah.
what you do. I wouldn't want to do this. I'm just going to be.
We didn't want to do this. This is not what I want to do.
My limits are pretty long, and that's a big one for me, so thank you. I appreciate people who are into numbers and counting and can do budgeting, so I appreciate y'all's time.
Thank you.
Well, our final slide, this is the final Taxpayer Tuesday for 23-24, so thank you all for attending all year, and I assume we'll return next year.
Yeah, Jennifer, you'll send out a survey again to everybody who attended like we did last year. We did a lot.